My name is Hazel, and I am 27 years old. For as long as I can remember, there was always a chill in my own home, and its source was my stepmother, Brenda. It wasn't the kind of chill that comes from an open window on a winter's day, something you could fix by simply closing it and lighting a fire. This was a deeper, more pervasive coldness that seeped into the very walls of the house I grew up in, into the furniture, into the air we breathed. It was a climate controlled entirely by her presence. She was never kind, never warm. I search my memories, sifting through the years like pages in an old book, looking for one single, unambiguously warm moment from her, and I find none. There is no memory of her reading me a story, no recollection of her bandaging a scraped knee, no image of her smiling at me with genuine, unforced affection. Her smiles were rare, and they were always for my father, a performance of contentment that never reached her eyes when they fell on me. They were tight, practiced expressions that vanished the moment his back was turned, leaving her face a placid, unreadable mask. She never tucked me in at night. This is a specific, aching memory. I can still recall the sound of my father's footsteps on the creaky floorboard outside my door, a comforting prelude to his arrival. He would sit on the edge of my bed, his weight a familiar dip, and ask me about my dreams or tell me a silly joke. His presence was a blanket, but after he left, the room felt larger, emptier. The hallway light would cast a long, distorted shadow from my doorway, and I would listen, always listen, for her footsteps. They never came. Not once. There was no goodnight kiss, no gentle smoothing of the covers. There was just the silence, and the knowledge that on the other side of the wall, in the master bedroom, she had my father all to herself. She never asked me about my day at school. I would come home, my backpack heavy with the weight of the day, the spelling test I aced, the painting I was proud of, the mean things Sarah Jenkins had said at lunch. My father would ask, "So, how was your day, kiddo?" And I would spill it all out, the triumphs and the tragedies. Brenda would be there, perhaps polishing a vase or reading a magazine, and she would listen, but she didn't hear. She was a statue in the room. There was no follow-up question, no. And then what happened? Or how did that make you feel? Her silence was a wall. Eventually, I learned to keep my stories for my father alone, delivering them in hushed tones when we were in the kitchen getting a glass of water or outside checking the mail. My childhood became a series of edited highlights, shared in the stolen moments when her influence waned. I felt like a ghost in my own house, a piece of furniture my father had brought into her perfectly curated life. The house itself was a testament to her taste. Everything was beige, cream, or a muted gray. The cushions were always plumped, the surfaces gleamed with a sterile cleanliness, and there were no messy art projects left on the table, no stray toys underfoot. I was the one incongruous element in her still life painting, a splash of unpredictable color on her neutral canvas. I remember learning to walk on the balls of my feet to be quieter, to immediately rinse any cup I used and place it perfectly in the dishwasher, to contain my existence within the four walls of my bedroom so as not to disrupt the perfect, cold order she had imposed. I wasn't a daughter. I was an occupant, a guest who had overstayed her welcome before I had even learned to talk. My dad, he tried. He was a kind man, a man whose laughter could genuinely warm a room. I could see the constant, quiet struggle in his eyes. He was caught between the woman he loved and the daughter he adored, a man split neatly down the middle. He would try to bridge the gap, to create a facsimile of a happy family. "Brenda, look at the drawing Hazel made," he'd say, holding up my crayon masterpiece. She would offer a perfunctory glance, a hollow, "lovely, dear," before returning to her task. His shoulders would slump, just a little. He would try to defend me in subtle ways. "She's just a child, Brenda. The mess can be cleaned, or it's her home too." But he was no match for Brenda's cold, calculating nature. Her weapon was never loud anger. It was a slow, steady drip of passive aggression, a silent disapproval that was heavier and more effective than any shout. She would give him the silent treatment for hours if he took my side, and I could see it wore him down. He loved her, and my childish heart ached watching him choose peace, time and again, because the alternative, confrontation with her, was a war he did not have the energy to fight. He loved me fiercely, I never doubted that, but his love for me became a source of his own guilt, and my love for him became tinged with a desperate pity. So, I learned to keep my head down. I became an expert in the art of invisibility. I learned the rhythms of the house, the time she was in the kitchen, the living room, the garden, and I would plan my movements accordingly. I built my own life away from them. School became my sanctuary. Friends' houses became my refuge, places where I could laugh too loudly and leave a plate on the counter without a searing glance of reproach. I filled my time with clubs, with homework, with anything that would keep me out of that beautifully decorated, soul-crushingly cold house for a few more hours each day. I built a Hazel who existed separately from the ghost in the beige house. But the feeling of being an outsider never truly left me. It was a constant, low hum in the background of my life, like the sound of a distant refrigerator you only notice in the dead of night. It was there when we sat down for a meal, the three of us, the conversation polite and superficial. It was there during holidays, where our family photos looked like a stock image with a random child photoshopped in. It was the way she said, "Your daughter," to my father, a subtle but deliberate separation that forever placed me on the other side of an invisible line. It was the knowledge that I was fundamentally other, an appendage, not part of the core unit. This wasn't a fleeting teenage angst. It was a foundational truth of my existence, a fact as simple and as unchanging as the color of my eyes. It was a truth I had simply learned to accept, because to fight it was to wage a war against a glacier, slow, exhausting, and ultimately futile. I armored myself in silence and independence, all the while carrying that constant, low hum of not belonging. The day of my father's funeral was the grayest, most heart-wrenching day of my life. It wasn't just an overcast day. It was a day that seemed to have had its very soul bleached out. The sky was a seamless, oppressive sheet of iron gray, so low and heavy it felt like a ceiling pressing down upon the world, upon the mourners, upon me. It was a specific, funereal gray that promised no break of sun, no hint of blue, only the perpetual, damp chill that seeped into black wool coats and clung to the skin beneath. The air itself was motionless, thick with the scent of wet earth and the cloying, sweet perfume of the floral arrangements that surrounded my father's casket, a scent I would forever after associate with loss. The world had lost its vibrancy, its sound, its meaning. Everything was muted, everything was slow, and everything ached with a profound, hollow absence. I was lost in a sea of grief, a vast, shoreless ocean where I was drowning, my lungs burning with the effort to breathe, to simply exist in this new, unbearable reality. The funeral service in the chapel had been a surreal montage of half-heard hymns, the drone of the pastor's voice, and the blurred faces of relatives and family friends. Their sympathetic smiles and soft touches on my arm felt like they were happening to someone else, to a version of me that was merely going through the motions of being human. My true self was trapped somewhere deep inside, screaming, railing against the injustice of a world that could continue to spin on its axis when my father was no longer on it. I was trying, with every fractured piece of my will, to process the fact that the one person who made me feel seen was gone. He was the one who would look at me and truly see Hazel, not the quiet, accommodating girl I became in Brenda's presence, but the real me, with my messy thoughts, my loud laughter, my secret dreams. His gaze had been a validation of my very existence. Without it, I felt invisible, ghostly, as if I might simply dissipate into the grim afternoon air. The finality of it was a physical weight on my chest, a stone of sorrow so heavy I wondered how my legs continued to hold me upright beside the gaping wound in the earth that was to be his final resting place. And then she was there, Brenda. Her presence did not register as a comfort or a shared sorrow. It was an intrusion, a jarring, discordant note in the already funereal silence. The other mourners had begun their slow, respectful retreat towards the line of black cars, their heads bowed, giving me a wide berth of solitary grief. But her approach was different. It was direct, purposeful, cutting a path through the dissipating crowd with an unnerving sense of agenda. The fragile bubble of my anguish was punctured by the sharp heel of her reality. Brenda approached me after the ceremony, when I was at my most raw, standing alone by the piled, moist earth of my father's grave. Her face was a mask of false sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. I knew this mask intimately. I had seen it at school plays where she was more concerned with who was watching her than with my performance, at birthday dinners where her smiles were timed for my father's benefit. But here, in this sacred space of ultimate goodbye, the mask was more obscene than ever. It was a caricature of mourning, painted on by a hand that felt nothing. Her eyes, always so calculating, so cool, were dry and clear, devoid of the red, swollen evidence of true tears. They scanned my face not for shared pain, but for a reaction, assessing the damage like a surveyor. She held out a plain, white envelope. It was so ordinary, so starkly out of place. It wasn't the rich, creamy stationery she used for her correspondence. This was the cheap, utilitarian kind, the kind you find in office supply stores, meant for invoices and tax documents. Its crisp, sharp corners seemed to mock the soft, decaying edges of the world around us. A cold, tight smile was on her lips. It wasn't a smile of shared memory or comfort. It was the smile of a transaction concluded, a balance sheet finalized. It was a smile that sealed a vault. "This is your share of the funeral costs," she said, her words clipped and businesslike. There was no tremor of emotion, no hushed reverence for the dead. Her tone was the same one she might use to discuss a dry cleaning bill or a grocery list. It was clean, efficient, and utterly devoid of soul. "It's the least you can do." The words hung in the damp air between us, each one a small, precise slap. The least you can do. As if my love for my father, my grief, my very presence as his daughter, could be quantified and settled with a monetary contribution. As if our relationship had been a ledger all along, and this was the final entry. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was a sudden, violent expulsion, as if I'd been struck in the solar plexus. The world tilted on its axis. I couldn't believe it. My mind, already fractured by loss, reeled, trying to find a foothold in this new, breathtaking level of cruelty. Here I was, shattered, my internal world a landscape of ruin, mourning my father with a pain so profound it felt like a physical amputation. And she was handing me a bill. She was reducing the complex, beautiful, messy tapestry of a father-daughter relationship to a line item for a coffin for flowers, for the digging of a hole in the ground. She was treating his passing, the most significant and devastating event of my life, as if it were just another transaction. The sheer audacity of it cut through my grief like a knife. The numbing fog that had enveloped me for days was slashed open, and in that clean, sharp incision, a new sensation flooded in. It wasn't hot, blinding rage. It was something far more potent. A cold, hard clarity. It was as if a lens had been wiped clean, bringing the world into a focus so sharp it was almost painful. In that crystalline moment, I saw Brenda with absolute lucidity. I saw the lifetime of calculated coldness, the strategic exclusion, the way she had always viewed me as a financial and emotional liability. This was not a moment of spontaneous pettiness. It was the culmination of her entire worldview. And in that perfect, icy clarity, my sorrow did not vanish, but it was joined by a steely resolve. The grieving daughter would have to wait. The survivor had just been handed a weapon, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, exactly how I was going to use it. The envelope in her hand was her final move in a game she thought she had won. But she had just made a catastrophic error, and the game was far from over. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat that echoed the chaotic thrum of my own blood in my ears. It was a visceral, almost painful rhythm, a stark contrast to the funereal stillness of the cemetery around us. For a moment, I thought the sound was audible, that Brenda must be able to hear the frantic animal panic of my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The shock of her action, the pure, unadulterated venom of presenting me with a bill over my own father's fresh grave had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system, so potent it made my fingertips tingle and my vision sharpen to an almost painful degree. The gray world suddenly held a new, terrifying resolution. The initial, suffocating wave of disbelief began to recede, and in its wake, something else began to rise. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of childhood. This was different. This was a cold, solid certainty that anchored me to the spot when every instinct screamed to turn and flee from her, from this place, from the unbearable cruelty of the moment. I felt the heat of humiliation rise to my cheeks, a burning flush that threatened to betray the storm of emotion inside me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to crumple the envelope in my fist and hurl it back into her perfectly composed face. I wanted to shout every vile, pent-up word I had ever swallowed down in the name of keeping the peace for my father. The images flashed behind my eyes, me, a small child, hiding a drawing behind my back because she had criticized the messiness of the colors, me, a teenager, eating dinner in silence while she and my father discussed their plans for a vacation I was subtly not invited to, me, a young woman, feeling my spirit shrink every time I crossed the threshold of the house she had made a home only for herself and my father. But I did none of those things. The ghost of my father seemed to stand beside me then, not as a sad specter, but as the man who had taught me to tie my shoes, to be brave, to always think before I acted in anger. In the face of her calculated, ice-cold provocation, a hot-headed reaction would be a victory for her. It would prove I was the emotional, unstable child she had always subtly painted me to be. It would allow her to dismiss me, to paint herself as the wounded party dealing with a hysterical stepdaughter. No. I would not give her that satisfaction. I would not let her see the fracture. I would not let her have the last word over his body. So I kept my composure. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I consciously stilled the tremor I felt beginning in my hands. I forced my breathing to slow, taking a long, silent inhale through my nose, pulling the damp, chilly air into my lungs, using the cold as a focal point. I straightened my spine, a subtle shift, feeling the black wool of my coat pull taut across my shoulders. I let my face, which had undoubtedly been a canvas of raw grief moments before, settle into a calm, neutral mask. It was a mask I had learned from her, ironically. I had spent a lifetime observing the way she could erase all emotion from her features, presenting a placid, unreadable surface to the world. Now, I mirrored her own polished detachment back at her. My face became a calm lake, its surface undisturbed, giving no hint of the turbulent depths and the dangerous, cold creature that had just been awakened within them. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had approached. I took in the subtle lines around her mouth that her smile did not erase, the perfectly styled hair that not even a day of mourning could disrupt, the expensive, understated black dress that spoke of taste, not grief. I saw the woman who had built a fortress of coldness around herself and had mistaken it for strength. She had no idea that the quiet, accommodating girl she had spent years marginalizing was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just been handed the final, incontrovertible proof that there was no bottom to her spite, and in doing so, Brenda had forfeited any last claim to my mercy or my silence. Without a word, my movements deliberate and unnaturally steady, I reached into my purse. My fingers, which moments before had felt numb and clumsy, now found their target with unerring precision. They closed around the thick, heavy envelope I had carried with me all day. It had been a weight in my bag, a secret so immense it had felt like it should glow through the leather. I had brought it as a form of self-preservation, a strange, desperate talisman. A part of me had feared a public scene, a confrontation over the will, some new, final act of exclusion that would forever sever me from my father's memory. I had needed to have my own ammunition close, a reminder that I was not entirely powerless, even if I never used it. I had agonized over the morality of it, of wielding such a devastating truth, especially today. But now, as my fingers brushed against the crisp paper, All doubt evaporated. Her bill was not just a request for money, it was a declaration of war. And I was done retreating. I pulled out the thick envelope, its weight a satisfying, solid presence in my hand.
It was my turn now.
The transaction was not yet complete. I handed it to her without hesitation. My arm did not shake. My gaze did not waver. I looked directly into her cool, confident eyes as I extended my own piece of paper, my own truth. "And this is for you," I said, my voice steady and clear. It did not sound like my voice. It was lower, calmer, devoid of the tearful tremor that had been there all day. It was the voice of the woman I had become in this single, defining moment. The words were simple, but they hung in the air between us, charged with a meaning she could not yet comprehend. They were not an offer. They were a delivery. They were not a plea. They were a pronouncement. She looked momentarily confused, her cold smile faltering for a fraction of a second as she took it. Her fingers, manicured and cold, brushed against mine. She was expecting perhaps a check, a pathetic attempt for me to pay my way, to meet her on her own transactional terms. She was expecting to see me capitulate, to acknowledge her financial authority even in death. The envelope was heavier than a check, bulkier. Her brow furrowed just slightly, a tiny crack in her impeccable facade. She had no idea that the envelope didn't contain money or a sympathy card or a letter of pleading. She had no idea that she was now holding, in her own hands, the lit fuse of a bomb she had helped to build over 2 decades ago. She had handed me a bill for a funeral, a final, cruel severance. I had just handed her the truth that would unravel her entire world, and the cold, hard clarity that had replaced my sorrow now settled into a grim, resolute certainty. The game was over.
She just didn't know it yet.
Inside that envelope were the results of a DNA test I had taken a month ago, a decision that had not come lightly. It had been driven by a nagging feeling, a lifetime of subtle inconsistencies that had fermented in the back of my mind like a sour wine. It was the way my aunt, my father's sister-in-law, would sometimes look at me during family gatherings, a look that was not merely avuncular, but held a strange, deep-seated melancholy, a flicker of something that resembled guilt. It was the way my uncle would sometimes clap my father a little too hard on the back, his laughter a decibel too loud, his camaraderie feeling just slightly performative. It was in the old family whispers I had overheard as a teenager, snippets of conversations that halted abruptly when I entered a room, words like "a difficult time" and "so much strain," and they worked through it for the boys, that never quite added up to a coherent story, but always seemed to orbit my father and my aunt from the years just before I was born. The feeling was a ghost in my peripheral vision, a shadow I could never quite turn and face directly until my father's final illness made the need to know, to truly understand my own origins, a pressing, undeniable force. I had tested with my cousin, Mark, the son of my father's brother. He was the closest in age to me, and we had shared the vague, benign connection of childhood holidays and occasional summer barbecues. He had been just as curious about the opaque chapters of our family's past, and we had agreed, with a sense of shared adventure, to unlock a piece of our history. We had joked about finding out we were descended from pirates or royalty. We had not been prepared for the truth that the cold, algorithmic certainty of science would deliver. When the email notification arrived, my heart had hammered with a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. I clicked the link, the digital page loading slowly, and then I saw it. The results didn't show we were cousins. The percentage of shared DNA was not in the range for cousins. The word itself was nowhere to be found. No, the truth was far more destructive. We were half-siblings. The words on the screen, in their sterile, official font, seemed to scream. Asterisk you share 25.3% DNA. Predicted relationship. Half-sibling. Asterisk the world tilted on its axis. The air left my lungs in a single, sharp gasp. My father. And my aunt. The pieces of the puzzle, the whispers, the looks, the strained dynamics, all slammed together in a single, devastating tableau. My father had an affair with my aunt, A betrayal so profound it had reverberated silently through our family for decades, a foundational crack in our reality that had been expertly papered over. And my uncle, a man I had called uncle my entire life, had been raising his brother's child as his own all these years. He had looked at Mark, his son, every single day, knowing the truth. The weight of that secret, the sheer, staggering magnitude of that silent sacrifice, or perhaps that silent resentment, was almost too much to comprehend. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, a bizarre, newfound connection to Mark, a crushing sense of betrayal from my father, a dizzying pity for my uncle, and a strange, detached sorrow for the aunt who had lived a lie every time she looked at me. And in the center of this maelstrom of familial wreckage stood Brenda. Brenda, who had married my father for the security he represented, for the comfortable life he could provide. Brenda's precious inheritance, the money and the house she had so clearly married for, the assets she had guarded with the tenacity of a dragon, was now legally threatened by the existence of another direct heir. Mark was not just a nephew, he was a son. My father's son. In the eyes of the law, his claim to my father's estate was as strong as mine, potentially stronger depending on the nuances of the will and state law. The financial fortress she thought she was securing with her petty bill was suddenly, catastrophically vulnerable. The foundation of her future, built on what she assumed was her undisputed share, had just been mined from beneath her. The family's dirty laundry was no longer a hidden secret, a shameful story to be whispered about behind closed doors. It was printed on official paper, right there in her hands. It was documented, certified, and undeniable. I watched as her eyes, those cool, assessing eyes, scanned the document. I saw the journey they took, from initial confusion at the legal-looking header, to dawning comprehension as they found my name and marks, to the final, horrifying moment when they landed on the conclusive phrase, half-siblings. I saw the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly, waxy pale. Her perfectly composed mouth, which had been set in that cold, tight smile, fell slightly open. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor started in her hands, making the paper rustle like a dry leaf. Her mask of cold composure finally shattered. It didn't crack, it exploded. The facade of the stoic, dignified widow crumbled into dust, revealing the stunned, avaricious, and terrified woman beneath. Her eyes, wide and shocked, flickered from the paper to my face, and in them, I saw the rapid calculations, the frantic assessment of the legal and financial ruin this single piece of paper represented. I saw the realization that her power, her control, her future, had just evaporated in the space of a 30-second read. And in that moment, standing over my father's grave, with the scent of turned earth and funeral flowers filling the air, I finally had the upper hand. The grief was still there, a vast and permanent scar on my soul. The confusion and pain of the truth were still settling in. But as I looked at Brenda, at her shattered mask and her trembling hands, a profound, quiet stillness settled over me. The ghost who had walked through her house, the inconvenient child, the billable daughter, she was gone. In her place stood the keeper of the truth, the one who held the key to the very foundation of the world Brenda had built. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched her, my own expression as unreadable as the gray sky above us. The transaction was complete. She had given me a bill for burying my father. I had given her the truth that would bury the life she had planned. And for the first time in my life, in the shadow of my greatest loss, I felt a terrifying, powerful, and absolute sense of peace.